Okay. Hello, welcome. My name is Leo, and I am the Vice President of the Alberni Valley Transition Town Society. So that's the group that's putting this on today. And we're a group of basically just community members, neighbors, and we're working together to try to prepare for and mitigate the impacts of climate change in the Alberni Valley and globally as well, and to help the community transition to a zero carbon future, not just in terms of energy, but in terms of an economy, trying to build a community that is more just, more equitable, more ecologically and socially sustainable. As part of that mission, we are increasingly trying to recognize and support the concerns, ambitions, and leadership of the Sishat and Hupachesset communities whose territory, unceded territory we're on, and have been significantly dispossessed of the wealth and the use of their traditional and unceded territory here in the Alberni Valley and the Alberni Inlet. So that's something we're working on, and it's something that we're going to be touching on a little bit more today. This is the third in an event series we're putting on this year. We're trying to do monthly events to parallel or sort of broadly parallel the city's official community plan process. So for those of you who don't know, the city is working on a 20-year timeline official community plan this year. And these events are designed to get people to come out, get together, talk about a lot of things that are really relevant to that official community plan process and just the vision that we collectively have for the community. Today's event is focusing on the economy, something that everybody is concerned about, no matter who you are. And we have two speakers today. They are looking a little squished with that aspect ratio, so I apologize, Cliff, in particular. I made this on a different aspect ratio computer than the one it's on right now. So Dr. Cliff Atleo, and Elvie are going to be our virtual speakers today, so you can see them up on the screen there. They're both coming to us from the Lower Mainland. I'm going to introduce them both now, and I'll just talk about the setup of the evening, do a few introductory remarks, and try to keep it fairly short here. So Cliff is Tsimshian and Nuchanel, and he is an assistant professor at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. He is interested in how Indigenous communities navigate, adopt, resist neoliberal capitalism while working to sustain their unique cultural identities, worldviews, and ways of living. Cliff is particularly interested in how Indigenous leaders continue to assert agency within the confines of settler colonial politics and economics and work tirelessly to lead their communities in more sustainable directions. And that's something that Ken Watts of the Sishat has spoken about quite a lot, the different pressures that Indigenous communities face in the current social and economic climate. Cliff has recently published on Indigenous water and land relations, Indigenous community responses to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and is working on several exciting research projects on cleaner marine transport and Indigenous community responses to crises such as COVID-19 and climate change. Elvezio del Bianco, who I believe goes by Elvie, is the Director for Cooperative and Government Relations with the BC Cooperative Association, and he's been working in that role since January 2022. He works to build partnerships with government, allied trade unions, post-secondary institutions, and other civil society organizations to realize a strong enabling environment for the development and growth of cooperative enterprises. LV has almost 20 years experience in the cooperative sector as a consultant, co-op developer, and as Van City Credit Union Cooperative Portfolio Manager, where he led numerous study tours exploring the cooperative economy of the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy. So those are our two speakers. And after my sort of introductory comments, they're going to do 20-minute talk each, and we'll have 10 minutes for questions after each of those talks. When that's done, we are also joined today by two representatives of local businesses. So we have Terry Deacon here from INEO and INEO Employment Locally. Terry runs a variety of different social enterprises in town here. She has a focus on circular economies. And we also have two members of the Alberni Valley Growers Collective here. So we have Miriam and, where am I looking? I've lost you both here. Miriam and Kirsty Allen, thank you. Yes. Okay, and they're both joining us as well. Chris Washington was going to be joining us from Flandangles, but unfortunately her flight was delayed. And then we have a variety of sort of workshop activities, sort of boards that we'll collectively work to fill out, but we'll get to that after the first part of this talk here today. So I want to just start off with an understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about an economy here today. We're not just talking about Wall Street, and we're not just talking about money, and we're not just talking about, you know, everything that we think of when we think of the economies, banks and a bunch of acronyms. We're talking about a very local set of processes today in particular. And wherever you are, we all understand that we have limited resources. At the same time, we have a lot of needs. And in today's society in particular, we have a lot of wants as well. And an economy is a system of organizing the distribution of those limited resources. And it's constrained by values. There's lots of different types of economies, and what exactly those systems look like depends on what values you're building your economy on. So if you're building your economy based on a value of competition and private wealth accumulation, you're going to get one type of economy. And if you have an economy that's built on the values of equity, personal and community wellness, you're going to build a different type of economy. So we're talking about a very local process here, and we're asking, what can this look like in Port Alberni? How can we meet our needs and wants locally here with values that we define here that respect the limited resources that we have? There has always been economic systems in the Alberni Valley. We've had thousands of years of economic systems that were developed by the Hupetchesep, by the Sishat, by the Coast Salish, New Channel, by all of the Indigenous occupants of Vancouver Island. There have always been limited resources here, and they were able or are able to live here in ways that have been able to bring joy and abundance and culture and arts for thousands and thousands of years without depleting their resources. And I'm not saying this to appropriate or to sanitize that history. I'm saying it because it's a very direct contrast to what happened in a very short period of time when colonialism came here and started to use those same resources. And I'm just showing these two pictures here. It's an undated photograph of a potluck ceremony and then a cultural sharing event from 2020. So when my ancestors, not mine in particular, but my cultural ancestors came here, we had a very different approach to the usage of resources in the valley. So on the left-hand side there, that's a basking shark that were once plentiful here and are now eradicated from these waters. And then, you know, whatever the resource is, whether it's whales, whether it's forestry, we have certainly led a history here of depletion and degradation. We no longer have enough natural resources left to continue with the economies that we built here. And if there's one thing that we can learn from the First Nations of Vancouver Island, who have lived here for thousands of years, been able to thrive and love and sing and dance and have joy, it's that there's nothing fundamentally inadequate about the natural world. It is able to provide, and it's able to provide good ways of living. What is inadequate is our approach to the sharing and the utilization of resources. We don't have a housing crisis or a toxic drug crisis or desperate poverty because the environment itself is not abundant enough to sustain a vibrant culture. It clearly is. And basically what we're asking now as we are forced to transition in our economy is how can we use different values now to build an economy that's going to allow us to thrive and live here for in harmony with our Indigenous neighbors, let's hope, for thousands of years. So We want to see change in Port Alberni. We're in a moment of change. We have multiple cascading global ecological and social crises that are playing out, and we have to change in response to those. We need to work towards reconciliation in the economy. If we're thinking about a 20-year timeline for the OCP, for example, it's unacceptable now that there are different economic realities for settlers and for First Nations people in Port Alberni, and it would be beyond unacceptable for that to be true in 20 years. We have a lot of social problems in Port Alberni. We have a crime rate that's almost double the national or the provincial average. The violent crime is more than double. We have the third highest death rate from toxic drug overdoses in the province. So we have a lot of problems. We both need change and we want it. And I think I skipped no, I didn't skip a slide. Yeah. And we have a lot of faith and belief that economic growth is going to bring about those changes that we're hoping to see. And it certainly can. You need certain new types of resources to bring about certain changes. However, it's not just a wonder solution all on its own. It depends what kind of economic growth it is. So economic growth can have significant environmental and social impacts. So we can have economic growth here and still participate in a worsening climate crisis, in a worsening biodiversity crisis, in worsening social inequality. And very importantly to the local residents of Port Alberni, it's possible to have economic growth here and have worsening affordability and worsening economic inequality. So for people who are marginalized in Port Alberni now, there's no guarantee that economic growth is going to produce better social outcomes for them. Oops, and I don't know why that just went through. So what we're trying to achieve with this event is to talk about different values that we can use to build an economy that does a number of things that firstly respects and supports First Nation economic goals, empowerment, leadership, and relations. We want to build an economy that respects the physical and ecological systems and communities of the planet. That's really important to the Alberni Valley Transition Town Society. We want to create better quality of life for everyone in Port Alberni by creating meaningful work and material affordability, and we really mean everyone. And then I can't see the bottom of my slide either, but I think it says contribute to a better quality of life for everybody globally or some such. I don't remember what the last line is, but it's a statement about global solidarity. I don't like to know that the things that I purchase and use are made by someone who's exploited somewhere in the world. I don't want that to be a part of my life. So we need to build a way to move away from it. So with this event, we're hoping to work on identifying values to guide us towards an economic future that we want. And then in terms of the OCP process generally, and just participating in discussions about economic growth and development in Port Alberni. Once we identify those values, we can identify mechanisms through which we can implement those values into the economy. So of course, it's not easy to sit here. We're not all planners, although I know there's a few in the room. We're not all planners, so it's not easy to know what all of the policy tools and levers are necessarily, but we can all start with identifying what our shared values are. And it can be hard to identify them, and it can be hard to identify the possibilities that are out there. And that's what I'm hoping our two guests today will help us with, some of those big, difficult questions. So I'm going to hand this over now to Cliff. And the time is 7:14. So I'll keep an eye on the time for you. I'll give you sort of the 5-minute warning and so on. And we'll have time for questions for each speaker immediately after they've spoken.
All right, thanks, Leo. Can everybody see my screen okay? Okay, yeah, thank you for the invite. Elvie, it's good to see you. I can't believe it's been 14 months since I saw you last. I had to double check my calendar the last time we had a meeting. And yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm Nuu-chah-nulth on my father's side, so I go by the name Cha-Chim Muthli. And my brief presentation here today is called Making an Economy in Your Forever Home. And so we have a joke in like a lot of Native communities. We have this question usually said with a pretty strong accent, who's your mother? And in this case, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who my mother is and who my father is. My dad is Cliff Atleo Sr. He did a term or two as the NTC president. He was also a chief negotiator for the House First Nation, and he goes by Wiccan-Inish. We are from the House of Glockenspiel, the Atleo family. And like I said, my name in New Channel is Chachim Matli. I'm Tsimshian on my mother's side. She's from up around Terrace and Prince Rupert. She's from Kitsilas, and we also have relatives in Kitsum Kalem and Lakwalams. And I have two names in the House of Nis Hawas, Smoiget Nis Naya, which is a title and a name. It's like a sub-chief underneath my uncle, who is the chief, who holds the name Nis Hawas, and my aunt, who I was actually just having dinner with earlier today. She was in town. My aunt is about 81, I believe, and her and her husband were visiting. She came to town to play bingo, from the small town of Terrace to the big city of Vancouver to see her relatives and play a little bingo in the big city. I also hold the name Gamayam, from the House Nis Hawas. In terms of my Western credentials, I guess, I have a Master of Arts in Indigenous Governance from the University of Victoria and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Alberta. I was in Edmonton for a couple of years, and I am currently an assistant professor in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. And I'm speaking to you right now from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories, actually on Burnaby Mountain itself. I live and work up here. I should also add, my wife and I own a bookstore in Vancouver. She is the president, and I'm the vice president of our little bookstore corporation. And I often think about that particular experience. The bookstore is now almost 5 years old. And previous to that, we had a book truck, which we actually did bring to Port Alberni on a couple occasions, and Ucluelet and Tofino a few summers ago. We started out in a mobile bookstore, and then we built a brick and mortar. And as a kind of a fairly high level, political economy researcher, I think more about economies at the macro scale, but certainly having a small business really makes me think a lot about how running businesses fits in to the economy, and I'll get into that in a little bit more as well. Okay, so I often start off with kind of, why do I do what I do? How did I get here? And one of the things I remember, so I grew up mostly in Vancouver, and I often spent summers on Vancouver Island visiting my dad's community of Ahousaht. I also had my grandmother lived in Nanaimo, so I spent a bunch of time in Snuneymuxw territory. And I do remember as a kid coming to Port Alberni in the 80s, the smell. It had a very distinct smell. Obviously, tremendously lots of mills, and definitely a forestry, industry town. And one of the things I remember coming across in some of my research, particularly around forestry and forestry management, was that there was a period of about 13 years, roughly from about 1980 to 1993, where logging companies logged half of the public timber in BC within just that one short period. So we saw a lot of intensification of logging, of industrial scale logging, which led to many disputes. Obviously, Clayoquot Sound, the War in the Woods, was closest to home, but also up in Haida Gwaii and in Carmana, in the Stein Valley. There was in the Great Bear Rainforest. Over the years, there's been logging has been a flashpoint between logging companies and workers and towns and environmentalists and Indigenous peoples all over the province, really. And I also, in my particular research areas, I also really think a lot about 2002. So I was living in Port Alberni at the time. I worked for the New Channel Tribal Council, and I was the treaty manager of our comprehensive claims negotiations that we were engaged in at the time with BC and the federal government. And I know this isn't exactly, but I always say 2002 is a year that will live in infamy for me in terms of motivating my research interests. The I remember seeing a headline. So the Hashisa newspaper had a headline in March of that year that claimed a Howsett had declared war on fish farms. And there were fish farms in Clayoquot Sound at the time, but there had just been an escapement from one of the fish farms. 10,000 Atlantic salmon had escaped. And it was also the occasion of an expansion of, they were wanting to expand fish farms. And in my research in later years, I came to realize that, just 6 months later, we had signed an impact benefit agreement, or what they called a protocol agreement, with the salmon farming company. And we have renewed confidential impact benefit agreements ever since. So part of me, was quite opposed to finfish aquaculture. As a scholar, I've come to understand a little bit more about, the context that led up to this. But there are also a number of other activities. So mining companies, and I can never remember which one. There was a company called Double Star. There was a company called Imperial Metals. A number of different companies had exchanged the tenure specifically for Catface Mountain in Clayoquot Sound, or as we know it as Chitapi, specifically interested in opening up an open pit copper mine in Clayoquot Sound. And so I remember that was, the mining tenures were circling at that time in the early 2000s through the mid 2000s. And so I became quite interested in the impacts of this more sort of industrial scale economic development. And then also that same year, the Howsett launched their court case. I believe there are 5 parties to that court case now, and previously there were about 8 new channel communities that were trying to reestablish or gain legal recognition for their commercial right to fish. And that has always been contentious. Other court cases like the Sparrow case out of Musqueam, have led to pilot sales agreements that we've witnessed in Port Alberni at various times being contentious whenever they sign an agreement or don't sign an agreement with DFO. There also was an arrangement made, like I said, with the Musqueam, but also some Skeena First Nations up near my mom's territory. But one of the things that really stood out with me, so like I said, I was still working at the tribal council at the time, so I was privy to things like the court case launch. And one of the things that really stood out for me was by 2002, when we launched that case, we had 6 large scale fishing vessels. And when I mean large scale, I mean not the mosquito fleet or not the punts, but trawlers, gill netters, little, seine boats, bigger boats. By 2002. At the peak of our participation in the West Coast fisheries, we had over 200 fishing vessels. And so from a period of time, within the span of one generation, basically from my father's time to my time, we went from a situation where almost every new channel person was fishing, or, was directly related to somebody who was fishing or involved in fish processing, to a time by the time 2002 rolled around where almost nobody was fishing. And you had, hundreds and hundreds of people that didn't have anybody in their family directly related to this industry anymore. So we've certainly witnessed significant declines, and this goes all the way back to Captain Cook times. When Captain Cook arrived in 1778 in Mowatcha territory, he began what essentially was the maritime fur trade in the trade of sea otter pelts. And we saw, and a lot of this I look at in my PhD, we saw successive different types of industries lead to extirpation of species, or the extinction of species from a specific area, like sea otters, the commercial whaling fleets off the west coast of North America. And now we've seen with forestry, significant declines. And this is just how, in many ways, this is just how resource extraction works, resource capitalism works. So, about a week ago, I had no idea what I was going to talk about. But I started to, or I was mentioning to Leo that one of the things that's really been resonating with me lately is this idea of home and what it means to people, particularly Indigenous communities, and particularly in looking at how we understand decision-making in those communities. So this is just a rhetorical question, but what does home mean to you? As Leo's already mentioned, the west coast of Vancouver Island has been home to New Channel peoples for thousands of years. The Alberni Valley is home to Tshad and Hupitchis First Nations, and of course, hundreds and hundreds of other New Channel people and other Indigenous people, and now, of course, thousands of non-Indigenous people. But like I said, part of what has been interesting me is how Indigenous communities really don't see any other home. Like contemporary life is pretty transient. We tend to think, we come from other places, we move to other places, we move for careers, we move for jobs, we move to go to school. But at the end of the day, particularly in a place like Vancouver Island, for Nuu-chah-nulth or Kwakwaka'wakw or Coast Salish peoples, they will never have any other home, and they never even conceive of or think about the possibility of another home. Even for people like me who live in Coast Salish territory, I still talk about going home or visiting home, and that's something that will always be there. One of the things I've found in my research is that Indigenous leaders are often dealing with acute crises, rampant poverty, multiple socioeconomic issues, and so very sort of urgent needs, like immediate needs. But I've also found that they are often mindful of long-term and long-term planning, long-term needs, and continuously working to assert their rights and responsibilities of self-determination. And so I was interested in this idea of long-term thinking. When I talk to my students, they basically think often about next week, when the quiz is coming up. In the business world, we think about next quarter or the next 2 quarters or 3 quarters. And there certainly is a certain short-term element to how we envision our interactions, especially with the economy in contemporary society. So 20 years is pretty impressive to honestly and genuinely think about where we would like to see ourselves in that time span. There are many Indigenous communities across North America that often talk about 7 generations. And if you figure a generation is 25 or 20 to 25 years or so, maybe it's getting a little bigger these days, that's 120 to say 150 years. I always like to talk about my uncle Senan Charlson, the late Senan Charlson from Heshquit. When I was working in the tribal council and he was representing Heshquit First Nation at the treaty table, I remember him one time saying that we should be planning for 500 years. And on some level, people can't even conceive of what that's like, especially if you think 500 years back, right? If you think about John Cabot and Christopher Columbus and people moving around on sailing ships, let alone thinking what might things be like in the 26th century, I guess. Most people, either it just seems unrelatable or silly. And the only reason I like to bring it up, or one of the main reasons, is because Senan was absolutely serious. He was he was very intelligent, like I would say even genius intelligent. And so often he was misunderstood, kind of awkward, didn't relate necessarily to people the way a lot of us do. But I had a lot of respect for his vision and the fact that he had the ability to really think. He really did think that this was something that we should do. So that long-term thinking, I think, is important, and for a couple of reasons. One is it's humbling, because also, I mean, like, who thinks about what their great 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 grandkids or nieces or nephews or the next generations are going to inherit? And I think we do in a very general sense, sort of in an abstract sense, most of us can. But on another level, it's humbling because you can feel like what you're doing may not make much of a difference. But I like to think of it in terms of angles, if you will. Like if you think of degrees, and if you think of a course correction or a course adjustment of 1 or 2 degrees right now, over a long enough period of time, you end up here, whereas you would have ended up here, which can be a very different place. So I do appreciate, recognizing that what we can do might seem insignificant in this point in time, especially within our lifetimes. I mean, I've only got another, I don't know, 30 years maybe, if I'm lucky. But you can be a part of something that is quite significant down the road, that I think is important in terms of this, like I said, this emphasis of responsibilities and not so much just on rights. So just a bit of a background on my research. I tend to think about issues. I do a lot of research on resource issues like forestry, fisheries, fish farms, fossil fuel extraction. Leo mentioned I'm onto a couple of new projects like decarbonizing the marine space and looking at what alternatives we might look towards for hydrogen or electric or hybrid vessels. And I often looked at a lot of these issues through these particular lenses. So understanding our place within Canada, which is a settler colonial country, within the confines of neoliberal capitalism, like how we manage our economy. Environmental politics in a place like BC just has come up over and over again. So we also, as Indigenous people, are contending with environmentalists, sometimes working alongside, sometimes working in contention with, or even in antagonistic ways. And also underlying this, like I said, a strong belief in their right and responsibility of Indigenous self-determination. Always wanting to have greater decision making, having the ability to make decisions in their territories, which, like I said, may seem like a pretty straightforward thing, but it's something that we've obviously struggled with for as long as Canada and British Columbia have been in place. And I'm aware that I have just 3 minutes left, so let's see what I got here. And in particular, I think navigating capitalism is an important one. In some of my research I've done, I've looked at these 4 Indigenous scholars. David Newhouse is, I believe, is Oneida, so he's from the Haudenosaunee peoples in the Great Lakes region. He talks about capitalism with a red face. Robert Miller is a lawyer in the United States at Arizona State University, talks about reservation capitalism. Dwayne Champagne is or was at UCLA before he retired. He talked about tribal capitalism. And Dr. Wanda Watney is, I think she's in Saskatchewan or perhaps Manitoba. She's a Cree scholar. She has talked about Cree capitalism. And all this is to say that there's various ways in which Indigenous communities have had to engage these systems, and where people like Miller have feel that just there's nothing wrong with capitalism and we just need more of it. You have people like Champagne and Watney who are more critical of the toxic aspects of capitalism and look for ways to mitigate or ways in which Indigenous communities can engage these economies in a collective sense that emphasize collective priorities, but also collective distribution of wealth as opposed to individual accumulation. So a lot of this stuff is areas that I've looked into, and of course I can't talk about this without my friend at UBC there, Glenn Coulthard, who's a Yellowknives Dene from the north there, where he says, for Indigenous nations to live, capitalism must die. I don't think it's dying anytime soon. I don't know if any of you heard my CBC interview a few weeks ago where I said it's not going to disappear. This was around the Land Act proposed amendments and when they were going to, and when the provincial government withdrew those amendments. And I was just saying that I don't think the amendments were going to be that radical. They were, like I said, capitalism isn't ending tomorrow, but a lot of people did freak out about giving Indigenous peoples more say. And it's a bit ironic because all they were doing was going to make it in line with legislation they've already passed, DRIPA, but we're still struggling to gain recognition and, like I said, have more of an impact on decision making. So a few concluding thoughts. This is actually from my PhD dissertation, where I talk about living Nuu-chah-nulth to like live one's culture. Where I write is a resist to shallow and commodified expressions of culture. It's a rejection of destructive settler colonial economic practices and the revival of traditional Nuu-chah-nulth principles through living on our lands and waters, honoring our responsibilities, and respecting our relations. And these are also a few other quotes that I pulled from my PhD. This is my uncle Richard Umik from Ahousaht, where he talked about the realities of change and continuity in Nuu-chah-nulth communities, that they aren't, this isn't anything new to us, although settler colonialism certainly has had the biggest impacts. but we have weathered many changes before and always work to continue to try and assert our agency through those changes. And then finally, my good friend from Tloquit and Checklissit, Chawanis, was speaking of her great grandfather. And this is a quote from her master's thesis where she wrote of him: "He clung tenaciously to the belief that our ways are valuable and can carry us through the coming generations with strength, honor, dignity, freedom, and hahufli," which is recognition of the chiefly territories of a community. And I think that's it. So thank you very much. Let go.
Thank you so much, Cliff. Cliff, can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We have time for questions. Would anybody, we have a mic. Where did this is our mic, right? So if you would like to ask a question, we just ask that you come up and speak into the mic.
Oh, and I have to say, Leo, you're a PhD student at UBC, is that correct?
I was.
You was, okay.
I did finish it, but
So you're a doctor now, Dr. King?
I don't identify as a doctor very much, but yes, yeah.
I was going to say you have an impressively small internet footprint.
Thank you.
I had to do tons of digging, and it takes
Actually very
skill to not
flattering.
have.
Thank you. I've worked hard to cultivate no footprint. Hasn't been easy.
I
Yeah.
mean, there was a famous Lenora King, Dr. Lenora King, in the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame, I think, from 100 years or so ago. But
Yes. Yeah. She helps bury me
okay.
digitally. So, um, we have a question here. We can, let's absolutely ask it. And then maybe if we can save other questions till after Elvy's gone as well, and then have a sort of bigger discussion there.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah, please go for it.
Cool. So my name is Mitch McLeod. The question I have is like, what do you propose? Like, you're suggesting we go back to the old traditional ways, I guess, is what you were saying. And I'm totally on board with that and living more in tune with nature and all that. But I'm wondering if you have any proposed solutions to like, how do we transition from the current society that we have where everyone's focused on resource extraction and like bringing in like maybe tourism or being more holistic, I guess, with the resources and all that we have. But if you have any suggestions on how we can start to make that transition.
Yeah, I mean, I usually tend to identify more traditional principles because I think some of the principles are transferable. Not all the practices are or are possible. But I also think about, so forestry is a really good example. I'm not a forestry expert at all, but I one of the things at my school here, we go on this tour, and one of the stops on our sort of on a tour of this sort of field school that we do is in Shaquetin territory, so just west of Kamloops. They have a forestry operation there, and they were just giving us an example. Like we went out into the like to where they were sort of actively logging, and one of the examples they gave was that the First Nations Forestry Company operated in this area with, what was it? It was like a horse and 6 people would log an area, selectively log an area, and it would take them 6 weeks of work. Whereas a more contemporary forestry company would use one man and a machine, and he would log that area in 3 days. So I just bring it up as an example because, forestry doesn't have to be done in a particular way. One model is very capital or profit oriented, where it's taking those efficiencies of that one person over 3 days and funneling all those profits up to shareholders or to, if it's a privately held company, to the owners. Whereas another model is a bit more circular. You can employ a horse, although the horse probably only eats oats or whatever, but you're employing 6 people for 6 weeks, a tremendously much longer period of time. So I only give that as an example in response to people who say that, we need resource extraction or development. I think it's how we engage in that is really important. And there are ways that we could do that are much more labor intensive, that give people jobs and livelihoods, that aren't funneling billions of dollars up to people who don't need more in many ways. The how we get there, my short answer is just, in some ways, is just think about local and small, but more widespread, I guess. Lots of local, lots of small.
Cool. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for saying, Cliff, that it's that you think about it more in terms of principles. I did print off, there's a few lying around there. I printed off the Tseshat First Nations economic development, some parts of their document, and then also the Hupacheset mission and vision as well, because I think the principles that are laid out in it, they're sort of right at the beginning of the document, principles and values, and they guide their whole economic development strategy. So I think it's pretty humbling the extent to which they are currently leading the way in answering a lot of those questions and how you put those principles up front. Elvie, did you want to, why don't we have you go, and then we can have sort of a dual question period at the end and have a back and forth with answering the questions.
Sure. You hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Leo, to participate here. Cliff, it's very nice to see you again. I'm shocked that it's been 14 months. Let time go. I am speaking to you from what's now East Vancouver on the unceded traditional ancestral and territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. We'd like to acknowledge that the impact in historical and ongoing colonialism in this country is a system of discriminatory and racist practices, and the modern cooperative model itself has been used by settler communities as a colonial tool. We are committed to honoring, listening to, and continuously learning from diverse perspectives amongst Indigenous peoples in this province. And as an organization that aims to support an inclusive, just, and cooperative economy, it's imperative that we work in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in British Columbia. Leo, I fear I may have given you an old bio. For my sins, I am now the co-executive director of the BC Co-op Association. And I'm going to start, hopefully without upsetting Cliff too much, to use some broad sweeping generalizations and some metaphors about our economic models, because I want to get to how these are different from the kind of tool that the British Columbia Cooperative Association promotes with the cooperative enterprise model. I'll start with this illustration, this rough illustration of a steam engine. Modern economic theories were developing at roughly the same time as theories of physics were kind of coming into the fore. And many in this new school of economy relied on physical science models as analogies or metaphors for what was happening in their economy at the time, which were using these kinds of devices. So the steam engine we can think of as this device where we put raw materials into machine, we cook it up, and we produce energy. This is in this case, the economy is a device or machine for changing states of matter and creating energy, i.e. taking capital and turning it into something profitable that will provide some benefit. Now, I don't think this is a particularly good analogy for the economy as a whole, but I think it's a pretty accurate illustration of a capitalist economic model, because probably it ignores too many things, like who is putting the coal into the machine? Who is harnessing the energy, i.e. the returns from this process? And what about the particulate matter that's coming out of this device? What impact does that have? That's something that we generally don't talk about too much in these kinds of models. But there are other models. After this reliance on these kinds of physical models, the biological sciences were really coming into their fore. And it provided some alternative ways of looking at our economy, or some alternative metaphors for the way we look at our economy. And we think of biological models as being integrated closed loops, right? Where resources are consumed and distributed back into the system to produce further resources. Now, this is a simplification, obviously, and there is competition in these kinds of resources, but there is an overarching cooperation in that the various components work to sustain the system as a whole. Now, if you've ever attended a garden, this may make some intuitive sense. You don't pile up the fertilizer and the seeds in one part of the pot. You spread things around, because that's how you make things grow and benefit and create more. If we want to take intensified localized growth as a biological metaphor, like we see with the accumulation of wealth in very few hands in our current economy, the biological metaphor there is cancer, right? And not a healthy system, obviously. So when I talk about capitalist versus cooperativist, what do I mean? In a capitalist system, we would say people are put in the service of capital. You work for capital. Most of us work for capital in order to create a return on investment for those making that investment. In a cooperative economy, we would say capital is put in the service of people, put in service of people's real needs. And I'll explain this more in a little bit. We could say that a capitalist economy is extractive. It takes of resources and puts them in other hands. It takes of rents from people. In the cooperative economy, again, we try to tweak this idea, and we think of it being participatory. We create opportunities for people to live and thrive and survive within an economy. Economy is not a machine that we tend to. Economy is something that gives us opportunities for us and our families. The general function of capitalist economy, aggregating markets, right? We want to aggregate a market for the thing that you didn't know you needed until somebody told you that you needed it, and you were going to be unhappy unless you bought it. In a cooperative economy, things are a little bit more practical. We aggregate supply or demand in order to meet our needs. The balance of my presentation is talking about this model, because I think it's probably one of the world's best kept secrets. I mean, the modern manifestation of this model has been around. I mean, old examples of cooperation go back thousands of years. I mean, we've seen it in local economy, in local cultures here too. But the modern manifestation of this model goes back about 170 odd years or so, and is generally not taught at our business schools. And this is a shame, because about 1 billion people on this planet belong to at least one co-op, and co-ops employ more people than globalized companies do. And the attraction to this model is because it addresses real needs. People who form co-op don't do it to acquire some useless widget. It's about getting access to things like food or shelter, transportation, healthcare. It could be about creating some kind of common infrastructure to allow people to be able to compete in the economy. Or maybe it's about creating a meaningful employment opportunity for somebody. As I'm going to illustrate in a couple of minutes, co-ops are inherently flexible. They can be tailored. When we say co-op, we mean something very generally. It's an enterprise that is democratically owned and governed. And how it's applied in a particular circumstance will look very different depending on the community that's using it, in order to meet their specific needs. Co-ops keep capital local. Co-ops do not have, with very rare exceptions, external shareholders to reward. It's really based on your use of the co-op. And so that capital is not going to shareholders to put into a Swiss bank account. They're staying in the communities in which they operate. And there's been studies that have shown this, that $1 spent at a cooperative grocery store, a local cooperative grocery store, more of that money will stay in community, whether compared to one that is corporately owned or owned by shareholders that are not locally resident. Co-ops are also extremely resilient. There's been a number of studies done across this country and around the world. They come out every, I don't know, 12 or 15 months or so. I see another one of these, and they all pretty much say the same thing. at least up until the pandemic, and then we'll see what's happened since then. But that co-ops are twice as likely to survive as other forms of enterprise. And at my time at Van City, I certainly saw this. We'd see one of our co-op members get into some trouble, and they would start what sometimes we would unkindly call circling the drain. And in a great many circumstances, they would reverse that process because the members would rally and they would come to the rescue of their co-op. Their members need their co-op and want it to survive, and so there's a vested interest in supporting that kind of resiliency. And then co-ops generate all kinds of social and economic returns for members and communities. Co-ops are places that practice democracy. I've had a number of Vancouver City Councillors tell me that their first experience of operating in a democracy was they're sitting on the board of a credit union or sitting on the board of a co-op. Where democracy is under fire these days, I think it's really important that people have an opportunity in an economic institution to be able to express these kinds of democratic values. And co-ops are inherently based on reciprocal relationships. People who are not probably most of them not related to each other, exchanging, supporting each other, and thereby building trust and building social cohesion, which again, we could use a lot more of that. So to illustrate this, some of the differences between co-ops and companies, the other major form of enterprise. We all know companies from popular culture, from a good deal of the media. Everybody knows how companies, corporations work, right? Got a group of shareholders, some of them are directors. There's a voting structure in place, but it's not democratic. It's based really on how much it's a weighted vote. It's based entirely on how much investment you bring to the exercise. Board of directors are typically chosen based on those that have the biggest investment in the organization. They sit at the top, separated from the machine, the steam engine that is the business itself. With its CEO, management, and staff that creates the good or the service, and a customer base that takes advantage of these goods and feeds into it. What's the objective of this? Money, return on capital, dividends for those that have made the investment. No surprise. Co-ops are substantially different. And I'll start just by briefly noting the cooperative principles. This is the only form of enterprise that has an internationally determined set of principles attached to it. These are kind of like the core DNA of the structure, and really kind of describe the democratic component of the enterprise, how it's about members having skin in the game and putting their own capital into the enterprise. That's what unlocks your participation. That's what unlocks this democratic economy. Also, that it's about education, training, and information for those that are participating in this exercise, whether they're members or whether they're board directors, or whether it's the general public. I'm here participating in this forum. I'm to practice Principle 5. And in terms of the bigger challenge, we're not just trying to create individual co-ops, we are trying to grow a movement. And by that, it behooves us to work with other cooperatives in order to be able to mutually support our memberships and grow our respective memberships and meet their needs. With that in mind, the co-op structure we generally illustrate it in a very different kind of way. And again, it's a circle, and kind of adhering back to this kind of biological model. We start with this members on the outside. The members elect the board of directors. It's based on one person, one vote, or one head, one vote, however you want to define this, but not in terms of how much money you're bringing into the exercise. Everyone has the same voting rights. Now, the board of directors is ultimately responsible for choosing the mechanism by how the cooperative operates. It may look different from co-op to co-op, depending on what kind of resources they have. But that mechanism serves that membership. again, it's kind of a closed loop. It's not about, we would define the difference between a co-op and a company is not the return on investment, but the advantage of the use that you have of the cooperative, whatever good or services that it's providing you. So this is a voluntary association of members that come together. All members purchase a share. That share will vary dramatically from co-op to co-op. Some credit unions, like Van City, require what we'd call a symbolic amount, $5 to become a member. Others charge a lot more. Housing co-ops will often charge thousands of dollars in order to be a member, but you get housing at a much more affordable price. Some worker co-ops in British Columbia will charge $10,000. You get a job out of that. So it's a different kind of economic relationship in which everything is owned in common. Members get an equal, as I said earlier, get an equal say in terms of electing the board. And the board makes its key decisions as it would in any kind of organization. And if the co-op makes a surplus, the members get to decide exactly how that surplus is deployed. It could go back to the members as a kind of a patronage return for doing their business with the co-op, or it could be reinvested back in the co-op in order to be able to grow and serve more members, or some combination of the two. Now, co-ops always kind of fall into this kind of pattern that we start with a community. That community might be geographic, might be located in a particular place like Port Alberni. It might be demographic. Could be newcomers to this country. It might be some combination of those. It might be newcomers to this country living in Port Alberni, or however you want to define this community. This community has a common need for something. It could be a good or service. It could be employment opportunity. The co-op becomes the way of resolving that need and addressing and delivering on that need. And this is where I want to show you, I think, the beauty of this model in terms of how it does get used to serve various communities. Now, these are the logos of a whole bunch of co-ops that are based in British Columbia. A small portion of them, there's some 700 that operate in this area. And they are all democratically owned. They're all democratically governed. Some of them are even democratically managed. Those tend to be a little bit in the minority. But despite those kind of commonalities, these co-ops, and besides the fact that they do very different kind of work, they are there's a tremendous amount of difference amongst these co-ops. So, for example, these co-ops are co-ops of individuals, real people. So individuals like you and me would take out the membership share, or perhaps a family would take out a membership share on one of these organizations. These co-ops are co-ops of organizations. The act governing co-ops in British Columbia is very flexible, allowing for both of these things. So you'll see that PharmaSave and Home Hardware here, most people do not realize that these are in fact co-ops. These are co-ops of independent store owners who came together in order to be able to compete against the big box stores that were coming into communities about a generation ago. These co-ops, we would say, are quote, for profit. Again, in some co-op circles, this is a bit of a dirty word. Surplus oriented or commercial activity co-ops. So they're competing in the marketplace in order to be able to generate a margin or a return. And these co-ops are community service co-ops. That is, they have a not-for-profit status. The benefits that they provide are a little bit more broad. The benefit goes beyond the immediate membership to include the broader kind of community that they're serving. So there's a great deal of flexibility amongst the way these businesses, these enterprises can be created. The primary way that we distinguish is the nature of the relationship between the individual and the enterprise. So these we would classify as consumer co-ops. The people who are using the good or the service are the members. They are the ones who are putting up the capital and voting for a board of directors. This is where we would find many grocery stores. This is where we would find credit unions within this kind of space, or particular very specific health services like what's provided by Rainbow Health Cooperative, which supports people that are going through gender transition. But to dive in as a particular example, we could look at Moto, which is started in, so we think about the community here. This started over 20 years ago in the West End of Vancouver with some 19 members who decided that they didn't want to each own a vehicle, but they wanted access to a vehicle. So they pooled their resources and bought a couple of cars. Moto has now grown to across the Lower Mainland, in Nanaimo and Victoria and in the Okanagan. I'm a member of Moto myself, so that makes me a owner of some. I tell people I own 1,000 automobiles, and it's true. I own them with about 11,000 other people. I can get access to an automobile thanks to this membership. I don't necessarily have to own an automobile or a second automobile. I can use it as my needs dictate and do so in a way that is lighter on my pocketbook and lighter on the planet. These co-ops we would describe as producer co-ops. These are individuals or organizations that more or less work independently, but come together to share resources in order to be more efficient and more competitive within the marketplace. And to give you a specific example of this, we would say is what this organization up until recently was known as River Select, that has now been rebranded as Authentic Indigenous Seafood. And it is, the members here are indigenous commercial fishing enterprises. And their common need was supply chain coordination and marketing. So they work together in order to manage the catching, processing, and getting to market of seafood, and doing it in a way that serves the Indigenous communities that own these enterprises. River Select was primarily on the inland fishery. They are now expanding into the open fishery and are working with some communities on Vancouver and Island in order to be able to create new partners to participate in this exercise. And this is a project that is being actively supported by the BC Co-op Association at the moment.
Elvie, just because you asked, I will just let you know that you've got about four more minutes.
I'm right on track. Thank you very much, Leo. I'm almost there. This category is of worker co-ops. This is where the workers own the means of production. This is where the workers make the decisions in terms of how the business operates. And an example of this is International Women's Catering Cooperative. So these are women based in Victoria who have great cooking skills and catering skills and come from places other than British Columbia. And their need was for stable, well-paying, culturally appropriate, and flexible work and benefits, something that is in dire need generally, I think, in our economy. So they come together and run that business, not to benefit external owners, but to benefit themselves. They've eliminated the profit margin from the equation, and they put those dollars into their own back pockets. Those are all the positives around this model. Before we get into questions, I'd like to conclude by hopefully not on too downbeat a note, but just a little dose of reality. In that there are challenges in order to setting up one of these enterprises. Starting with defining that community of interest. That's easy to say, that's harder to do. Finding other people that share your need and coming together in order to be able to begin the process of addressing that challenge. When we work with communities, a common challenge is that there are often gaps in skills and resources that people bring to the table. Sometimes it could be a matter of financial resources. This is why we go down this path, because we're not independently wealthy. Sometimes it may be accounting or project management skills or whatever, but these are, if you're participating in this, you are responsible for trying to get this business off the ground, and those gaps can be not insurmountable, but an issue that needs to be addressed. And getting a group together and defining your incorporation documents is not going to resolve your problem. You need to actively develop the business of the co-op. That means a business plan. That means 3 years of projected cash flow if you want to get a loan from a credit union. And that is a lot of hard work. And that is the other challenge, is time. And I feel that this is probably one of the greatest challenges we have these days, is not enough time in order to be able to sort of manifest these things. As I've been talking these last 20 minutes, I could have incorporated a business online. A co-op, generally, in my experience, the fastest I've ever seen was about 6 weeks. And some have gone 12 months, 15 months, or longer in order to try to get their business up and running. But people go through this process because the benefits that they provide their community are pretty substantial. I'm just going to note this email. If there is an interest in going down this path, you can always reach us here. And with that, I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Elvie. And I did print off some brochures from the BC Co-op Association website and scattered them around. So I hope to see lots of new co-ops forming in Port Alberni. Thanks to both of you so much. That was pretty much exactly what I was hoping for, that Cliff would give us a really broad, values-based sort of, where do we need to go? What are the kinds of mentalities that we need to have when we're thinking about building an economy? And then the cooperative economic model is, I think, very grounded. There are a ton of examples in BC and also globally of how we can really build real enterprises that meet real needs. So I'd love to I'd love to facilitate some questions if there are any in the audience. Take your time. I know we already, oh yeah, please, up at the mic there. And I think.
So this is a very simple question on the issue of co-ops. In that governments, both provincial and federal, have huge spending capacity, largely of taxpayers' money as well as resource money. Are they significant supporters of cooperatives or mainly supporters of companies? Are you able to answer that?
Did you hear that question, Elvie?
Yeah, whether there's sufficient government support for this model. Sufficient, I would say absolutely not. Okay. Their support is sporadic. I think it's in 2022, the provincial government did make a substantial investment into BC's cooperative movement. We deployed those resources across the province, and we're seeing some great results come out of that. The fishing cooperative, the expansion of the authentic Indigenous seafoods was partly supported by that investment, amongst many others. We're still awaiting on year 2. That was a 3-year proposal. Election years are apparently not great times to be, putting big ideas in front of people running for office. This model is not sufficiently supported, not as it is in other jurisdictions. And I think it speaks to a bigger challenge that we have, that governments are not properly investing into civil society like they should be. Not just co-ops, but all kinds of other civil society agents. And we're doing community economic development, and we are not sufficiently resourced to be doing that on a scale that we would like to see.
Thank you.
I think we have one more. We have another question coming up here.
Hi, this is a question also in relation to co-ops. So I had approached someone at the Port Alberni Gas Co-op with the question regarding, viability, feasibility of a food cooperative in Port Alberni, given that there's 2 food co-ops on the West Coast and all of the supply trucks drive through Port Alberni to supply those outlets. And the person I did speak with indicated it wasn't financially viable here in competition with the big box food producers that, or not food producers, food retailers that we have. And I wondered, that was specifically like federated co-op, I think is the overarching group. And if you knew if independent co-ops, food co-ops, like the viability in kind of similar sized economies as Port Alberni.
I don't know specifically in Port Alberni what that would look like, but that's an exercise that can be conducted, right, in terms of a bit of a feasibility study to determine what the cost would be of trying to set up. I do wonder at that. We still see new co-ops coming up, new food co-ops coming up. Certainly in the interior of BC, there's some small co-ops that have food co-ops that are doing a great job of that, despite the presence of some of the major commercial food retailers being in town. They generally take a different orientation. If a good example to look at is the Monashee Community Co-op in Lumbee. They are sourcing from local producers, and they are trying to support local food systems. That's something that the retail suppliers are having a much harder time doing. So it could be that, I mean, all that is subject to the mathematics of it, right? But there might be a way of threading that needle.
And is that the work that you do partly in your association, is help to do those feasibility studies, or?
We can try and connect you to people that can help you do that.
Great.
We have a pool of consultants that we refer to, and we can connect you to people that can help with that exercise.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
And if we could just ask the question askers to just state their name.
Hello, Uklama Suwayakawith. English name is Jolene Dick. I am the CEO of the Alberni Valley Chamber of Commerce. This question is kind of for Cliff, and I think it's a tough one. So brace yourself. I'm curious, because we were just talking about cooperatives. The Chamber of Commerce is a membership-driven organization, and I'm wondering what the parallel may have historically been like. So the Chamber of Commerce is a board of trade and incorporated underneath the Board of Trade. I guess in ancient times or in Indigenous commerce times, what would be the equivalent back in the day if there was negotiations that needed to happen? Would that take place at a potlatch? Who would be the wrecking crew to kind of barter and trade and make sure that trade was fair and cooperative, kind of like in the model that Elvie was talking about? Do you understand my question?
I will try. So I think the biggest thing for me is, I mean, we had fairly stratified societies, quite hierarchical in some ways, but I think in some ways also misunderstood. So we had hereditary leaders, we had councils, we had ahiapit and tapatsi, like advisors and thinkers. I think one of the main differences is that nobody went without. So on one level, like, we didn't have a situation where people are homeless or impoverished, or, everybody sort of had basic needs in some ways. The second thing that I think about is in some ways how also our communities were misunderstood in terms of their, I wouldn't say like an expression of democracy, but so one example I can think about recently was the Housing Land Use Plan, where we had traveled all around the province talking to housing members, and specifically contentious issues like the fish farms or the copper mine came up. And the chiefs didn't make a decision that went against the people. So they consulted all the people. They all sort of had a chance to give some input, and ultimately the decision to walk away from the mine or not support the mine anymore and to revisit the fish farm case as an example were a different form of sort of consultation and engagement, but certainly not a liberal democratic model of like one person, one vote, or it was participatory in a bit of a different way. And then my final part of that answer is I think we also thought of wealth accumulation differently. in the potlatch model that you mentioned, you know, there was great prestige attached to um, capturing wealth and redistributing it. One of the expressions I remember an old timer saying was potlatch until you're broke. Like this idea, you know, we have some sense of how much potlatch costs in contemporary times, but you know, generating wealth and then redistributing it out to everybody and not holding on to that wealth. So whereas we now think of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Bill Gates or whoever that accumulate billions and billions of dollars as individuals, and don't redistribute until they retire and, I don't know, can have, you know, polish their name or legacy by being philanthropists. We didn't have a society that valued individual accumulation, and there were specific ways in which there was a sense of shame attached to somebody who was greedy or stingy or did not share. So those are the kind of the ways in which I think about where the values drive not only the political system but an economic system. And then, okay, I lied. The very last thing I think I'm thinking about in terms of that system is in contemporary society, we think that we have to watch out for ourselves. We have to have our pension plans. We have to have our RSPs because we're kind of on our own and like no one's going to take care of you. And so there's a drive of scarcity and being on your own where there's no safety net or mutual aid or understanding of that you will never go without. Whereas I think in some New Charlotte examples, we can think of there would always be family, there would always be other chiefs, there would always be other community members that would pick you back up again, I think. And that's a fairly big difference from today where we're a lot more individualistic in contemporary society.
Cool, thank you. I was not expecting that answer, but that gives me a lot to think about as well. I also wanted to give a shout out to authentic Indigenous seafood. I think I know I'm a Hoopachesit woman. I come from that nation. That Hoopachesit supplies some of the salmon that go to that co-op. So I think that's really cool. It's a local example where our Indigenous fishery contributes to that. And then just a final thought to share and reflection on what you just said, Cliff, is I often think of our current potlatches. If we were to move to a model where we were incorporating all the values that we've historically accumulated and transformed to modern times today, I think of the ideal potlatch and ceremony as like a governance place, but going back to having reusable spoons at potlatches and refillable water bottles and actually distributing wealth rather than just grabbing what might be on sale at a capitalistic wholesaler to say, we're going to give you tea towels and dishes and your glasses. Well, maybe not everybody needs that anymore, but like, what can we distribute as Indigenous people to the people and what they need? I know it's a lot more logistics in the end, but for anyone who's been to a potlatch, you kind of know you kind of come home with a bunch of stuff and maybe you're not going to use that stuff. So those are just my closing contributing comments to this conversation on modern economies. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
Did we have another question, a final question? Mike, you've got one final one? Great.
My name is Mike Hughes. I'm a transition town board member. In the last, I'd say 15 to 20 years in BC, I think we had the advent of a new hybrid model called a 3C, a community contribution company. And I'm wondering why we haven't seen more uptake of that opportunity. Now it's in legislation, and whether that would be of interest to smaller outlying communities such as First Nations as they grapple with the challenges ahead. Albie, can you answer that?
I'm certainly familiar with the 3C. I've worked, I know of exactly one that I've had some dealings with. I think there's something right now like 3 dozen of them across the province. Maybe there's more. I don't know. I'm no expert in them. Sure, it's a tool in the toolbox, right? It's a bit of a complicated model. I think it's having it's for those that don't know, it's a kind of a modified. It takes some examples of co-ops and companies, and it's some of the profit is redistributed back to community. It can be used. I'm not sure what it has a much shorter track record than what we've seen in terms of co-ops or other forms, and so I'm not sure what the best circumstances it is to employ that. But you know, I think it's right to bring them up. These alternatives are out there. They exist. There's legal frameworks for them, and I find it quite strange that when the business schools in this province seldom talk about structure when they're talking to their students about business. I mean, most of the time, it's the default is the company structure, and sometimes they talk about not-for-profit or society structures. And really, the exercise that we should all be going through when we're trying to address our issues, what are we trying to achieve with the resources that we have? And let's employ the model that is best capable of delivering on that outcome.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Elvie. Your answers, Elvie, your last one, and Cliff, they actually both, I think, transition well into just the second part of the evening, which is going to be a little bit more interactive. So at this point, Cliff and Elvie, I'll just thank you both so much for your time. I know it's an evening event and it cuts into family time and all that stuff. So thank you both so much. You shared so much knowledge and really inspiring stuff. Cliff, I really like your sort of statement about that trajectory. Just a nudge. It's hard when we have these really big pressing issues that are so urgent and imminent, but yeah, I mean, these are long time scales ultimately. So I don't know, we just got to get started. So thank you so much to both of you for everything you've shared tonight.
Thanks, Leo.
Thanks, Leo. Thanks, Cliff.
Take care, everybody.